The summer of 1995 was suffocating in the Balkans. The air was heavy with dust, the streets were lined with hollowed-out buildings, and entire villages sat abandoned, their walls scarred by mortar blasts and bullet holes. Croats who had endured 4 years of war could feel something was coming. Something enormous, something final. But before the world would witness Operation Storm, before the headlines would declare it the largest European offensive since World War II, there was despair, silence, and a nation cornered. Croatia had declared independence in 1991, but independence had come with a terrible price. The Yugoslav People's Army, alongside Serb paramilitary forces, had carved out massive sections of Croatian territory, establishing the self-proclaimed Republic of Serbian Krajina. This entity, backed by Belgrade, controlled nearly a third of Croatia. Its capital in Nin was fortified, its soldiers dug in, and its leaders confident that Croatia would never reclaim the land. For ordinary Croats, this meant exile. Tens of thousands fled their homes, watching Serbian forces raise new flags over their towns. For those who stayed behind, the war became daily terror. Artillery raining down on Zagreb, sniper fire cutting across roads, and massacres in places like Vukovar leaving a scar on the national psyche. By 1995, the situation was unsustainable. Croatia was split in two, its very existence hanging in the balance. In Zagreb, the leadership under President Franjo Tudjman and his generals knew they faced a stark choice: accept permanent partition or risk everything on one massive gamble. They chose the latter. But how could a country still recovering from the devastation of 1991 to 1992 launch an offensive of unprecedented scale? The answer lay in 4 years of painstaking preparation. Croatia had quietly built its army, the Croatian Army, or HV, from scratch. At first, it had been little more than a militia, men armed with old hunting rifles, smuggled weapons, and improvised armor. By 1995, however, with discreet foreign training, improved coordination, and relentless determination, the HV had become a modern fighting force. Still, no one knew if it was strong enough to face the entrenched Krajina Serb army, supported by tanks, artillery, and seasoned veterans of earlier battles. Yet Tudjman and his generals, most notably General Ante Gotovina, believed they could, and their target was clear: Nin. Nin was more than a city. It was the beating heart of the Republic of Serbian Krajina, perched on a hill, guarded by fortifications, and symbolic of Serbian dominance in the region. To take Nin would not only deal a crippling blow to the Krajina Serbs, but also send a message across the Balkans. Croatia was back. Still, the risks were staggering. The Serb forces were dug in, and any offensive risked not only catastrophic military failure but also international condemnation. NATO and the UN were already deeply involved in Bosnia, where the war had produced images of concentration camps and ethnic cleansing that horrified the world. Croatia could not afford to be seen as the aggressor, and yet, it had no other choice. By July 1995, the situation had reached a boiling point. The Krajina Serbs, emboldened by years of holding territory, had launched new attacks on Croatian towns, shelling civilians and testing Zagreb's patience. In Bosnia, meanwhile, the Srebrenica massacre had just shocked the globe, and Western powers were finally waking up to the idea that the Serb leadership in Belgrade could not be allowed to dictate the future of the region. Croatia saw its chance. If it struck fast, if it struck decisively, it might not only reclaim its lands but also shift the balance of the entire Balkan War. The countdown began. In the villages near the front, soldiers whispered among themselves. Many were barely out of their teens. Others were veterans who had already lost brothers, wives, and children in earlier battles. Each man knew the stakes. This was not just another offensive. This was the moment that would decide whether Croatia lived or died. Families prepared too, though in silence. Mothers hugged their sons tighter. Wives watched as their husbands packed their uniforms, cleaning their rifles one last time. The night before the operation, priests quietly gave blessings in dimly lit churches, their words muffled by the sound of distant artillery. And then, there was Nin itself. On the hilltop fortress, the Krajina Serb leadership held meetings in dimly lit rooms, smoke from their cigarettes hanging heavy in the air. They were confident, almost arrogant. They believed Croatia would never dare to launch a large-scale attack. The Krajina army had heavy artillery, bunkers, and favorable terrain. If the Croats come, one commander said, "We'll crush them," but they didn't know what was coming. Croatia's generals had devised a plan of breathtaking ambition. Instead of frontal assaults, they would coordinate a massive, multi-directional strike involving more than 100,000 soldiers. The operation would cover nearly 630 kilometers of front line. It would involve tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery barrages, and precision strikes designed to overwhelm the Serb defenses before they could properly react. It was Lightning War, Balkan style. The name they gave it was simple yet foreboding: Operation Storm. As the night of August 3rd turned into August 4th, tension reached its breaking point. Across Croatia, church bells rang at midnight. Soldiers lay awake, staring into the darkness, their hearts pounding. Generals studied their maps for the 100th time, their hands tracing the routes of armored columns that, by dawn, would cut through enemy lines. At 5 a.m., thunder rolled across the sky, not from nature, but from the roar of hundreds of Croatian artillery pieces opening fire in unison. The offensive had begun. For the Serb defenders, it was like the earth itself had exploded. Shells rained down on command posts, artillery batteries, and defensive positions. The horizon was lit up in flashes of orange and white, the sound echoing through the valleys. Within minutes, Croatian tanks began to advance, followed closely by infantry. Helicopters roared overhead, and special forces moved to secure key bridges and roads. Nin was in the crosshairs. What happened next would shock not only the Krajina Serbs but also the entire world. Because Operation Storm was not just a military campaign. It was the turning point of the Balkan Wars, a gamble that would reshape the map of Southeast Europe. And as dawn broke on that August morning, the world was about to see just how far Croatia was willing to go to reclaim its homeland. The morning of August 4th, 1995, began with a silence that was heavy, almost deceptive. For hours before dawn, the Croatian countryside seemed frozen in anticipation. Soldiers crouched in trenches, clutching rifles and whispering hurried prayers. Commanders checked their watches again and again, waiting for the signal that would unleash the largest military operation in Europe since the end of World War II. For the Serb forces of the self-proclaimed Republic of Krajina, it was just another night, another vigil in the war they had fought for years. But what they did not know was that the storm was about to break. At precisely 5 a.m., the quiet shattered. From hidden positions stretching hundreds of kilometers across Croatia, Croatian artillery roared to life. The sky lit up in flashes as thousands of shells arced into the air, raining destruction on Serb positions dug into hillsides, towns, and river crossings. The earth shook with the force of the bombardment. Veterans of the war would later say that they had never experienced such concentrated firepower. For the soldiers of the Krajina Serb army, many of whom had grown complacent after years of holding the territory, the sudden thunder was devastating. Communication lines snapped, command posts were obliterated, and defensive bunkers that had stood for years crumbled in minutes. The Croatians called it Operation Storm, Oluja in their language, and it had been planned down to the smallest detail. The offensive would stretch along a staggering 630-kilometer front, with multiple axes of attack converging toward one objective: Nin, the heart and capital of the Krajina Serb Republic. To strike so broadly was audacious, even reckless. But the generals in Zagreb, men like Ante Gotovina and Ivan Cermak, believed that speed and shock would collapse the Serb defenses before Belgrade could react. As the bombardment continued, the Croatian infantry and armor began their advance. Columns of tanks, their engines growling, rolled forward behind the protective curtain of artillery fire. Soldiers moved in waves, their boots sinking into the churned earth, their eyes fixed on the smoke-filled horizon. Many of these men carried deeply personal reasons for fighting. They had been refugees once, driven from their villages when Serb militias swept through years earlier. Some carried photographs of burned houses, others of family members who had never made it out. To them, Operation Storm was not just a military maneuver, it was a homecoming, a chance to reclaim what had been stolen. Above them, the Croatian Air Force joined the assault. MiG-21s streaked through the sky, their wings flashing in the morning sun, before diving toward enemy positions. Bombs slammed into supply depots, bridges, and artillery batteries. Each explosion ripped apart not just defenses but morale. For the Krajina Serbs, who had relied on static fortifications and the hope of Yugoslav or Serbian reinforcements, it was a nightmare scenario. What made Operation Storm particularly deadly was the intelligence behind it. While the Croatian forces carried the burden of the fighting, NATO surveillance aircraft circled high above. Satellites and reconnaissance planes fed vital information to Zagreb. Officially, NATO did not take sides, but in practice, its sympathies lay clearly with the Croatians. Every intercepted transmission, every mapped troop movement, gave the attackers a decisive edge. For the first time in the Balkan Wars, the Serbs were facing an opponent not just determined, but technologically superior. In Nin, chaos erupted almost immediately. The city, once the proud capital of the Krajina Serb Republic, awoke to the sound of shells whistling overhead and detonating nearby. Civilians rushed into the streets. Families hastily packed carts, cars, and horse-drawn wagons, creating endless convoys that stretched for miles. Columns of tractors piled high with mattresses, furniture, and children became the defining image of the exodus. It was the beginning of what would be one of the largest refugee crises of the war. More than 150,000 Serbs would flee in the days to come. For many, it was not just a retreat but the end of their lives in Croatia forever. On the battlefield, Croatia's elite brigades spearheaded the assault. The 4th Guards Brigade, known as the Posse, the Spiders, advanced relentlessly through western sectors, cutting through defenses with surgical precision. On another axis, the 7th Guards Brigade, nicknamed the Pumas, drove northward, their advance so rapid that even their commanders struggled to keep pace. These were not inexperienced fighters. They had spent years honing their craft in smaller engagements, and now, unleashed in full strength, they overwhelmed positions that had been considered unbreakable. But the Krajina Serbs were not without resolve. Around Petrinja, Glina, and in the Banija region, Serbian units mounted counterattacks. Snipers waited in ruined farmhouses, picking off advancing Croatians. Mines littered the forests and fields, slowing progress and forcing soldiers to crawl through danger inch by inch. The combat was savage and intimate. Grenades exploded at close range. Villages became battlegrounds, with walls riddled by bullets and streets turned into rivers of smoke and blood. Croatian veterans would later recall the terrible silence after firefights, when the only sounds were the crackle of flames and the distant sobs of civilians caught in the middle. Despite this resistance, momentum was firmly with Croatia. General Gotovina, directing much of the offensive, pressed his commanders to maintain speed. Every hour mattered. The longer the Serbs held out, the greater the risk that Serbia proper, or even Russia, its traditional ally, might intervene diplomatically or militarily. But Serbia was paralyzed. President Slobodan Milosevic, calculating the risks, had little appetite to drag Belgrade into open conflict with NATO. The Krajina Serbs were left to fight largely on their own. Meanwhile, President Franjo Tudman watched events unfold from Zagreb. His gamble was enormous. If Operation Storm succeeded, Croatia would regain control over territories lost since 1991, cementing its sovereignty and shifting the balance of the Balkan Wars. If it failed, the cost would be catastrophic. But as reports poured in, towns falling, roads captured, defenses collapsing, Tudman's confidence grew. He understood, as did his generals, that this was more than just a military victory in the making. It was the rebirth of the Croatian state as a unified territory. Yet victory carried shadows. As Croatian units advanced, stories began to emerge of atrocities committed against civilians left behind. Some soldiers, driven by vengeance after years of Serb aggression, looted, burned, and executed. The chaos of war blurred the line between military targets and civilian suffering. For international observers, Operation Storm would be remembered not only for its lightning speed but for the humanitarian catastrophe it unleashed. The images of endless columns of Serb refugees became symbols as powerful as any battlefield triumph. By the end of the first day, Croatian forces had advanced with breathtaking success. Defensive lines thought impenetrable had been shattered. Villages and towns that had flown the Serbian tricolor for years now saw Croatian flags raised once again. The road to Nin lay open, its defenders scrambling in disarray. Smoke filled the skies, rising from burning depots, destroyed vehicles, and abandoned homes. But Operation Storm was far from over. As Croatian units pressed deeper into enemy territory, the stakes only grew higher. The capture of Nin, the symbolic and strategic heart of the Krajina Serb Republic, was within reach. And with it, the fate of the entire Serb project in Croatia hung in the balance. The lightning had struck, but the storm was still gathering strength. The morning of August 4th, 1995, dawned with a sense of inevitability. Operation Storm, Operacija Oluja, was fully underway, and the Croatian army was pressing forward with a momentum that stunned even its own commanders. After years of stalemate, the front lines that had once seemed immovable were suddenly collapsing. For the first time since the war began, the Croatian flag advanced deep into territory held by the self-proclaimed Republic of Serbian Krajina. But what made this offensive so effective? And how did it escalate into the largest land battle Europe had seen since 1945? The Croatian army had meticulously planned every step of this campaign. Unlike the chaotic battles earlier in the war, Operation Storm was coordinated with precision. More than 100,000 Croatian soldiers took part, supported by artillery, tanks, and air power. The offensive stretched across 630 kilometers of front, making it impossible for Serbian forces to reinforce every position. The very scale of the operation became its greatest weapon. It overwhelmed the defenders before they could mount a unified response. The initial assaults targeted key towns and transportation hubs. In the north, Croatian forces moved rapidly to cut off supply lines running from the Serbian heartland into Krajina. Bridges were destroyed, communication networks disrupted, and defensive positions bypassed rather than assaulted head-on. The idea was simple but devastating. Create panic, fracture the chain of command, and force the Serb leadership to retreat before a decisive battle could even begin. Meanwhile, in the south, Croatian troops advanced towards Nin, the de facto capital of the Republic of Serbian Krajina. Nin was not only a symbolic prize, it was also the administrative and military heart of the Serb-held territory. If Nin fell, the entire political project of Krajina would collapse. Every Serbian commander knew this, but as Croatian units pushed closer, it became increasingly clear that Nin could not be defended without massive reinforcements. Those reinforcements never came. One of the keys to the Croatian success was their use of speed and maneuver. Tanks spearheaded thrusts through valleys and roads, while infantry secured high ground to prevent ambushes. Helicopters and fighter jets provided close air support, striking at Serbian artillery positions before they could target advancing troops. It was a demonstration of combined arms warfare that rivaled NATO standards. For a country that only a few years earlier had struggled to arm its soldiers, the transformation was astonishing. But behind this rapid advance lay years of preparation and quiet assistance from abroad. U.S. military advisors, though not officially participating, had provided Croatia with training and strategic guidance. This was not a NATO operation, but it was carried out with a level of professionalism that bore the fingerprints of Western military doctrine. The Serb leadership accused Washington of orchestrating the offensive, and while the truth was more complex, there was no doubt that Croatia had benefited from outside expertise. As the Croatian advance accelerated, Serbian defensive lines crumbled. Entire units abandoned their positions, leaving behind weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. Some fled to avoid encirclement, while others simply dissolved into the streams of civilians already heading toward Bosnia and Serbia. The retreat quickly became a rout. The exodus was staggering. Within days, an estimated 200,000 Serbs fled their homes in what would become one of the largest forced migrations of the Balkan Wars. Entire convoys of tractors, cars, and horse-drawn wagons clogged the roads, carrying families who had lived in those villages for generations. The scenes were haunting. Columns of refugees stretching for kilometers, under the watch of advancing Croatian troops. The Croatian government declared the offensive a liberation of its sovereign territory, reclaiming land that had been seized at the start of the war. For many Croatians, it was a moment of national triumph, a vindication after years of suffering and siege. But for the Serbs of Krajina, it was nothing short of catastrophe. Homes were abandoned, lives uprooted, and communities erased in a matter of days. The very existence of the Republic of Serbian Krajina, proclaimed with defiance in 1991, was wiped out in less than a week. International reaction was swift and divided. Western governments largely welcomed the Croatian advance, seeing it as a decisive step toward ending the war in Bosnia and Croatia. For years, peace negotiations had stalled because the Serb leadership believed their territorial gains were permanent. Operation Storm shattered that illusion. Suddenly, the balance of power had shifted dramatically, and the prospects for a negotiated settlement improved. But human rights organizations raised alarm. Reports emerged of atrocities committed against civilians, of villages burned, and of executions carried out during the chaos of the retreat. While the Croatian government denied systematic abuses, the fog of war concealed many grim realities. In the years that followed, these allegations would haunt Croatia's otherwise celebrated victory, raising difficult questions about the price of liberation. Nin, the crown jewel of the offensive, fell on August 5th. The Croatian flag was raised over the fortress that overlooked the town, and President Franjo Tudman himself declared victory in a televised speech. For Croatians watching at home, it was an emotional moment, proof that their long struggle for independence was reaching its climax. Yet the speed of the victory stunned even Croatian commanders. What they had expected to take weeks had unfolded in mere days. For the Serbian leadership, the defeat was humiliating. The dream of carving out a permanent Serbian state in Croatia was over. In Belgrade, Slobodan Milosevic faced a new reality. His ability to manipulate events in Croatia had been broken. Even more importantly, the loss of Krajina weakened Serbia's hand in Bosnia, where the war still raged. Operation Storm was not just a Croatian victory. It was a strategic earthquake that reshaped the entire conflict in the Balkans. And yet, the battle was not over. Serbian units that had escaped the Croatian advance regrouped across the border, vowing to fight on. In Bosnia, Bosnian Serb forces prepared counterattacks, and artillery strikes rained down on Croatian towns in retaliation. The war was shifting, not ending. Operation Storm had changed the map, but it had not erased the divisions that fueled the conflict. As the smoke cleared over Nin and the refugee columns stretched toward Bosnia, the world watched with a mixture of awe and unease. Croatia had pulled off a military operation that seemed impossible just months earlier. But the consequences, human, political, and moral, would echo long after the guns fell silent. The lightning advance had succeeded. The Republic of Serbian Krajina was gone. But in its place, a new question emerged. Had Operation Storm brought peace closer, or had it simply lit the fuse for the next round of violence? When the guns of Operation Storm finally fell silent in mid-August 1995, Croatia had achieved what had once seemed impossible. In just 4 days, the sprawling Krajina enclave, a self-declared Serbian stronghold that had defied Zagreb for years, had been smashed. Croatian flags flew once again over towns and villages that had long existed under another authority. For many Croats, it was nothing less than a national rebirth. But as with so many military victories, the price of triumph was far more complex, darker, and more enduring than the initial celebrations suggested. The images that flooded Western television screens in the days following Operation Storm carried two parallel realities. On the one hand, jubilant Croatian soldiers hugged each other, waving the red, white, and blue flag of their nation, posing for cameras atop armored vehicles, and celebrating what they called the liberation of their homeland. Civilians who had endured years under rebel Serbian control poured into the streets of cities like Nin, welcoming Croatian forces as heroes. For them, it was the return of sovereignty, the end of years of humiliation, and the promise of a future without partition. But alongside these scenes were others, haunting, somber, and devastating. Columns of Serb civilians, stretching for miles, fled their homes in tractors, trucks, and on foot, taking with them whatever possessions they could carry. These were not soldiers but ordinary families, fearful of retribution, convinced that remaining behind was not an option. The highways out of Krajina became rivers of humanity, one of the largest forced migrations in Europe since World War II. By some estimates, nearly 200,000 Serbs abandoned their homes in a matter of days. Entire villages were left silent, their windows shattered, their streets empty, their homes smoldering. The Croatian leadership, particularly President Franjo Tudjman, framed this exodus as voluntary. They insisted that Serbs left because they did not want to live in a Croatian state, that they had been ordered by their own leadership to depart. But for many international observers, the reality was far murkier. Reports emerged of arson, looting, and killings committed by advancing Croatian forces. Human Rights Watch and the United Nations later documented dozens of cases where elderly Serbs who had stayed behind were murdered, their homes torched. While Operation Storm was militarily brilliant, the shadow of ethnic cleansing loomed over its legacy. For Croatia, however, the strategic gains were undeniable. In 4 days, the country had restored control over nearly a fifth of its territory. The Serb rebellion that had plagued the nation since 1991 was effectively crushed. From a military perspective, Operation Storm reshaped the balance of power in the Balkans. Serbia, led by Slobodan Milosevic, suddenly found itself on the defensive. The defeat of the Krajina Serbs was not just a Croatian victory. It was a signal that the tide of war in the region was shifting. Indeed, the repercussions were immediate and far-reaching. Within weeks, Croatian and Bosnian government forces launched coordinated offensives against Bosnian Serb positions, rolling back gains that had once seemed permanent. NATO, emboldened by the collapse of Serbian defenses in Croatia, intensified its own airstrikes in Bosnia. The combined pressure from land and air put the Bosnian Serbs into their weakest position of the entire war. For the first time, the possibility of a negotiated peace settlement that did not overwhelmingly favor the Serbs became real. But the human cost continued to climb. The roads to Serbia and Bosnia were choked with refugees. Families camped in fields, their belongings piled high on wagons, uncertain of where they would be allowed to resettle. In Belgrade, refugees overwhelmed already strained infrastructure, their presence fueling political unrest and anger toward Milosevic's regime. Serbian media portrayed the exodus as a humanitarian catastrophe and accused Croatia of war crimes, while Croatian media insisted it was a natural consequence of a just war of liberation. Internationally, reactions were mixed. The United States, which had quietly supported Croatia with intelligence and planning assistance before the operation, publicly praised the military achievement while voicing concern about reports of atrocities. Washington's position was delicate. On one hand, Operation Storm had broken the deadlock of the Balkan Wars, pushing events toward a peace settlement. On the other, the mass displacement of Serbs risked undermining Western credibility in advocating for human rights. The European Union issued similar statements, acknowledging the military success but warning that Croatia's reputation would suffer if allegations of ethnic cleansing were proven. For ordinary Croatians, however, the focus remained on the newfound sense of security. Families displaced since the early 1990s returned to homes in liberated towns, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Schools reopened under the Croatian flag. For many, this was the culmination of their struggle for independence, proof that their young nation could stand on its own, militarily and politically. Tudjman, who had long promised that Croatia would be whole again, enjoyed a surge of popularity. Operation Storm became enshrined in Croatian memory as a national triumph, celebrated every year on August 5th as a holiday of victory. Yet for the Serbs who fled, the date marked catastrophe. Entire generations grew up in exile, never returning to their ancestral homes in Krajina. Property claims, legal disputes, and international arbitration dragged on for decades, with little resolution. Some Serbs did return in the years after the war, but many found their villages destroyed, their communities scattered. The scars of displacement ran deep, shaping ethnic relations in the Balkans for years to come. The military leadership of Operation Storm also became a subject of controversy. Generals like Ante Gotovina, Ivan Cermak, and Mladen Markac were hailed as heroes in Croatia, their names immortalized in songs, monuments, and public speeches. But at The Hague, in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, they were indicted on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The tribunal alleged that the Croatian leadership, including Tudjman, had orchestrated a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Gotovina was arrested in 2005 and faced trial, but after years of proceedings, he was acquitted in 2012, a verdict that was celebrated in Croatia and criticized by many Serbs. The trials highlighted the ongoing divide in how Operation Storm was remembered: liberation for one people, catastrophe for another. The geopolitical impact of Operation Storm was even more profound. The offensive not only ended the Croatian War of Independence but also set in motion the final chapter of the Bosnian War. The collapse of Serb positions and the NATO bombing campaign created the conditions for the Dayton Peace Accords later in 1995. Without Operation Storm, many historians argue, the war might have dragged on for years, with no clear resolution. It was the turning point that forced all sides to the negotiating table. But if peace came, it was peace forged in trauma. Croatia emerged victorious but deeply scarred. The Serb community within Croatia was shattered, its numbers drastically reduced. Bosnia was left with a fragile political settlement that institutionalized ethnic divisions. Serbia, humiliated by the collapse of its proxies, spiraled into political turmoil that would eventually lead to Milosevic's downfall years later. And yet, even decades later, Operation Storm remains contested terrain in memory and politics. In Croatia, it is celebrated with parades, speeches, and patriotic ceremonies, an emblem of national pride. In Serbia, it is remembered as a dark chapter, a tragedy of mass expulsion. Internationally, it is studied as a textbook example of modern offensive warfare: fast, coordinated, reliant on intelligence and combined arms. But alongside the military admiration lies an enduring question: at what moral cost was this victory achieved? For those who lived through it, the memories are seared into their consciousness. Croatian veterans recall the adrenaline of sweeping through enemy positions, the thrill of reclaiming lost towns. Serb refugees remember the dust of the roads, the smell of burning homes, the fear of never seeing their villages again. Both narratives are true, both real, both deeply human. In the end, Operation Storm was not just a military operation. It was a seismic event that reshaped the Balkans, redrew borders, and redefined identities. It was victory and tragedy, liberation and exile, triumph and trauma, all unfolding in the same 4 days of August 1995. And as with so many wars, the echoes of that moment continue to reverberate long after the last shot was fired. The summer of 1995 had cracked open a new chapter in the Balkans. Operation Storm was more than just a military victory. It was a seismic event that redrew borders, redefined identities, and left scars that still shape the region today. But while Croatia celebrated what it called liberation, the offensive had consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. To understand the true legacy of Operation Storm, we must look not only at the triumph, but also at the tragedy, the human cost, and the haunting shadow it left behind. When the guns finally fell silent on August 7, 1995, the Croatian flag flew over Nin, the heart of the self-proclaimed Republic of Serbian Krajina. For the first time in 4 years, Croatia had reclaimed its lost territory. Soldiers embraced in the streets, civilians wept with joy, and leaders declared the operation the crown of Croatia's independence war. President Franjo Tudjman, appearing on national television, told his people, "We have finally defeated the evil that threatened our homeland." The air crackled with pride, relief, and an almost euphoric sense of destiny fulfilled. Croatia was now whole. Yet, behind the triumphant images broadcast across the world, another story unfolded. A story written in silence, in fear, in the hurried footsteps of families abandoning their homes. As the Croatian army advanced, over 200,000 Serbs fled the Krajina in what became one of the largest mass exoduses in Europe since World War II. Entire villages emptied overnight. Families piled into tractors, wagons, and cars loaded with their belongings, forming endless convoys that stretched across the countryside. The road from Nin toward Bosnia became a river of refugees, moving under the scorching August sun, uncertain of where safety could be found. For many Serbs, this was not a voluntary departure. It was a desperate escape. Homes were burned, civilians were harassed, and in some cases, targeted killings occurred. The memories of these days are still etched in the minds of survivors. Elderly parents left behind, livestock abandoned, childhood photographs left in houses that would soon go up in flames. Croatia's liberation came at the price of another people's displacement, and in the chaos, the line between victory and vengeance blurred. International observers and human rights organizations began documenting what they called ethnic cleansing. Reports emerged of villages set ablaze, of looting, of civilians who never made it to safety. The Croatian leadership, for its part, denied systematic abuses, framing the exodus as a choice made by Serb leaders who urged civilians to leave. The truth, as often happens in war, was complex and contested. What could not be denied, however, was the sheer magnitude of the human tragedy. For the refugees, the road was merciless. Convoys were attacked by aircraft and artillery as they crossed into Bosnia. Some were killed while fleeing. Others died of exhaustion along the way. Mothers searched for missing children. Fathers buried loved ones in makeshift graves by the roadside. The image of these endless columns of people leaving their homes remains one of the most haunting legacies of Operation Storm. Meanwhile, inside Croatia, the victory strengthened Tudjman's government and solidified the nation's sense of independence. The military success convinced Croatians that they had not only survived but prevailed against overwhelming odds. It was a moment of national consolidation, a turning point that transformed Croatia from a fractured state into a unified actor in the region. Operation Storm became a symbol of resilience, a rallying point that generations would remember. In the eyes of many Croatians, it was the day their nation stood tall, defiant, and free. But the operation also shifted the balance of the entire Balkan conflict. With Croatia's victory, the Serb-controlled territories in Bosnia suddenly faced collapse. Operation Storm cut off supply lines and weakened the military position of the Bosnian Serbs, paving the way for NATO's air campaign, Operation Deliberate Force. Within months, the war's momentum shifted decisively, forcing all parties to the negotiating table. Without Operation Storm, the Dayton Peace Accords might never have happened. In this sense, Croatia's offensive was not only about reclaiming its own land, it reshaped the future of the entire region. Still, the moral weight of the operation remains deeply divisive. In Croatia, August 5th is celebrated annually as Victory and Homeland Thanksgiving Day. Parades march through Zagreb, veterans are honored, and the triumph is remembered as a national holiday. For Serbs, however, the same day is remembered as one of loss, grief, and exile. Families mark it as the anniversary of their displacement, a wound that refuses to heal. The duality of memory ensures that Operation Storm is both victory and tragedy, liberation and expulsion, depending on who tells the story. The international community, too, has wrestled with this legacy. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia indicted Croatian generals Ante Gotovina and Mladen Markac for war crimes, including the persecution of Serb civilians. Their trial was one of the most high-profile cases of the tribunal. Initially convicted, they were later acquitted on appeal, a ruling that sparked outrage among Serbs and celebration among Croats. The verdict highlighted not only the difficulty of assigning guilt in such complex conflicts, but also the enduring power of nationalist narratives. Beyond the courtrooms and battlefields, however, the most enduring impact of Operation Storm has been psychological. For Croatians, it instilled a belief that victory was possible, that unity could overcome division, that a small nation could withstand a larger aggressor. For Serbs, it reinforced a narrative of victimhood, displacement, and betrayal. For Bosnia, it created a fragile opportunity for peace, but also sowed seeds of resentment that still simmer beneath the surface. Even today, the legacy of Operation Storm shapes politics, identity, and relations between communities. Leaders still invoke its memory, sometimes to unite, sometimes to divide. Veterans still march with pride. Refugees still search for justice, for recognition, for a place to call home. And historians still debate. Was Operation Storm a necessary act of liberation, or was it an act of ethnic cleansing disguised as victory? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was the inevitable conclusion of a war that had already torn the region apart. And this is the haunting truth. Wars do not end when the shooting stops. They live on in the stories we tell, in the memories we keep, in the way anniversaries are marked, and in the silence of those who refuse to speak of what they endured. Operation Storm was both an ending and a beginning, the end of Croatian Serb control, but the beginning of a new phase of trauma, exile, and contested history. As we look back at Operation Storm 3 decades later, we are left with a question that defies easy answers. Can a victory truly be called complete if it leaves behind such suffering? Can liberation ever be separated from the cost it inflicts on others? And what lessons should the world learn from an offensive that was at once brilliant and brutal? Perhaps the lesson is this. In war, triumph and tragedy are inseparable. For every flag raised, there is a family displaced. For every city liberated, there is a village destroyed. For every story of victory, there is another of loss. Operation Storm reminds us that even the most decisive military successes carry shadows, and those shadows can stretch across generations. And so, as we close the story of Operation Storm, we are left not with certainty, but with reflection. History is never one-sided. The truth lies not only in the pride of those who won, nor solely in the grief of those who lost, but in the uneasy space between them. That space, the tension between victory and tragedy, is where the real story of Operation Storm resides. It is a story of courage and cruelty, of hope and heartbreak, of triumph and exile. It is ultimately a story that forces us to confront the hardest truth of all, that in war, nobody truly wins.